Hi, welcome to QuickTalk, the MedTech Startup Podcast. I'm Axel Strombergson, Vice President at Veeva MedTech. My guest in this episode is Vincent Cafiso, a former FDA inspector who also in his career has done a lot of other things when it comes to supporting medical device companies in bringing products into commercial distribution. Our conversation is going to guide you from early start of a medical device startup company through regulatory strategy, FDA submission, and then things that you should consider as you prepare for commercial distribution. Hi, Vin. Welcome to Quick Talk. Super excited to have you here today. I'm actually been looking forward to this conversation for a few weeks now. But before we jump in, why don't you share a little bit about yourself, your background, what you've done thus far, but also now with your recent role at Creo, what you guys do.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here, Axel. It's been something that I've been looking forward to myself. I'm always love to have these kinds of conversations, and when I get to do it with somebody like yourself, with such an awesome platform, it's a lot of fun. So just a little bit about me. I started my career as an investigator for the Food and Drug Administration, and after I did that, and through that, got the opportunity to do hundreds and hundreds of inspections of medical device and diagnostic firms. I then went into industry as a quality engineer, really learning what it is about quality and how to build quality systems and how to deal with problems and all of that. In those years after FDA, I worked at super small startup companies, bringing novel, high-risk technology to the market through the PMA pathway, all the way to some of the largest companies in the world in higher level quality and compliance roles. And just recently, within the last year, I've gone to consulting full time. And so I was a solo entrepreneur for a little while. And then I joined forces with Creo. Creo does consulting in the life sciences space around IT and digital type solutions and bringing those to businesses and making sure that they're all validated. They do a lot of cybersecurity and risk management type work. And then they also kind of work on the strategy and organizational effectiveness side, M&A and all of that. And then my area is, of course, quality and regulatory compliance, where we do mock inspections and we help with strategic planning for quality system implementations, for new product introductions and things like that. So so Creo does a lot more than I do, clearly in the life sciences space. So it was that opportunity for me to come here and sort of join forces with them and grow as well.
That's really great. Well, perfect background for what we're going to talk about here today. So, as you know, the intent with this conversation today is to kind of cover the journey of a startup, from early inception through the pre-commercial work and then getting into commercial distribution. So, if we start in a itty bitty start of the journey, tell me a little bit about what you have seen in your career that can be helpful for a startup to know in terms of how to set themselves up to be in compliance and then later then have a higher success when it comes to submissions and other things.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a really good place to start, right? It's like that initial phase of, hey, we have an idea, we have a solution, we have some problem, some unmet need that we want to bring to the market. And so, first of all, you should know, what is this product going to do, and where in general does it fit within the framework of FDA, right? Because FDA is so large and they have multiple offices, so you should know whether or not it is a device, a drug device combo, a drug only. Is it an in vitro diagnostic? Is it software as a medical device? And then that kind of helps you kind of orient yourself to what are the regulations that apply to my business. And generally speaking, right, founders and innovators and people who have these really, really brilliant ideas, they don't really know how to navigate that. So, this is not a sales pitch whatsoever, but generally speaking, these early startups will consult with someone who does have some of that information and can help point them in the right direction.
Mm.
It doesn't have to be terribly costly to just get some very early have some very early conversations with people that can point them in the right direction. In terms of like, again, what do they have to comply with, right? That's really the basis for how you're going to be operating from that point forward, right? So if we talk about a small company, brand new company, brand new idea, and say it's software as a medical device, or say it's some small, hardware that gets packaged and sterilized, right, or typical type of a consumable device. You would have to start your process, and this is probably the main answer to your question. Once you've figured out, like, what compliance is required, what the compliance requirements are, and what the regulations you need to comply with, generally speaking, if we're talking about a medical device, you have to start to document your design and development process. And that's the part where innovators can lose a lot of time because they are in this very early stage of innovating and having ideas and identifying user needs and coming up with a prototype and doing some testing of those prototypes and identifying suppliers. And all of that work ultimately has to be documented. But what I actually see is that innovators are actually doing this completely independent of the framework and of the compliance framework. So then they get like a year down the line and they realize like, oh, we should have been actually writing all of that stuff down, and we probably should have even created a procedure on how to do this, right? How to do design controls.
Right.
So again, that would, I think, be that initial kickoff with someone who is a little bit more familiar with the regulatory landscape and can kind of help them say, all right, at a bare minimum, we're not gonna try to sell you this huge quality system of procedures and systems and all of this. We just want you to say very early on, you need to figure out how to document your design and development effort. That is the basis for everything after that,
Right. Right.
right?
No, and I like what you're saying here also, because a lot of the people that both of us interact with are first-time founders, right? And a lot of what we talk about here when it comes to regulations, nothing of that is really complicated. But what these guys typically do is much more advanced, breakthrough technologies of different things. But that all being said, anything is complicated if you haven't never done it before. Like, take a different language, learning a new language may not be that complicated, but if you don't know you don't know what you don't know, right? So I like what you're saying there to if you haven't done this before and you're like a first-time founder, to find a good third party to lean on that can help you navigate and set you up in the beginning. I think that's really important. Which kind of leads me to the second question, which is also something that's really important, ties into what you just talked about, which is a regulatory strategy, right? So that's also, of course, a critical foundation. Like you talked a little bit about it. Is this an in vitro diagnostic? What is this? But taking that further, say that you have identified that it's a class 2 device and you are eligible for the 510(k) pathway. You may look at some predicate devices. But where I'm going with this is that, of course, you want to have some validation that your strategy is sound, and something that's really encouraged and has been for a long time now is to interact with FDA and work with FDA to make sure that you kind of are aligned on what this looks like. So talk to me a little bit about your experience there and give some guidance on how to do that, how to approach, how should you start to think about the FDA as a collaboration partner.
Yeah. No, that's another great sort of segue into the next piece of this because we're kind of moving in the order of when things should be happening, right? And so the earlier that you, again, consult with someone who is aware of the regulatory pathways, the earlier the better. And as you mentioned, Axel, there is a process, again, if we're just going to talk about medical devices, right? There's a process to say, well, hey, our device is substantially equivalent to another device that's already on the market. So our goal is to demonstrate that our product is equivalent. And so that's a lower bar. It's a little bit easier, but there are a lot of requirements of what needs to be documented and what testing needs to be done and what labeling you need to have, right? So that early on piece is where you would do a little bit of digging, a little bit of investigating to find out what might be your predicate device. And then with that, you can actually then go and consult with someone at FDA. So that was kind of what I was mentioning earlier, where you kind of understand like what area of FDA will be regulating your device, because even within device within CDRH, which is the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, there are different offices which cover the different technologies. And so once you get to that point, you could then easily set up a pre-submission meeting with the person who may or may not actually be the reviewer, but they would be able to say, okay, yeah, we agree that this is a predicate, and yeah, we agree that this is the type of testing that you should do. By the way, you should actually do additional testing because of X, Y, and Z, right? And so they may give you that initial, that initial pathway. And then at least you know that you're in the right direction. I mean, I have seen companies go with the strategy of it's better to sort of like proceed first and ask for forgiveness later, as
Yeah.
opposed to, asking for, because they want to maybe see what see what sticks, as opposed to, being afraid that maybe the FDA will ask for too much. I would
Yeah.
say whatever the FDA wants is what they will get.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And it's like kind of falls in the saying like fail early, fail fast or whatever, right? Especially
Mhm.
if you venture back, you don't want to wait until you actually have submitted to then realize that you need to do another animal study. That can be game over for a startup, right? So
Yeah.
no, 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 I totally agree. And unfortunately, I think sometimes you hear about that, the people that, they actually avoid doing a pre-sub. We're just going to go straight to the 510K or whatever. But I
Mhm.
think also the rejection statistics around submissions. I mean, sure, it's gone down since they introduced the pre-sub, but part of introducing the pre-sub as a communication vehicle was because the rejection rates are just sky high, right? So, but
Mhm.
anyways.
Yeah.
Um, very good. Yeah, no, and I think that's really important. So I also try to always encourage startups like, it's free of charge. A pre-sub is free of charge. Of course, you might have to pay a consultant a little bit of money to help prepare the pre-sub and navigate through that, but it's really worthwhile to make sure that you're on the same page early on. You touched upon design and development early in the conversation here. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So, you have figured out your regulatory strategy, sort of a type of testing that is expected, right, for safety and effectiveness. And you now go into design controls, you build final devices, you put them through design verification, design validation to get that data that's expected.
Mhm.
One area so in general, I think people understand that there is something that's called design controls, right, and risk management. So I think in general, that's kind of understood. Something that I think is an overlooked area that's not really talked a lot about, that I want to get your insights on, is when it comes to design verification, design validation, and traceability of devices used for that testing, right? So what I'm talking about here is like whether you have a software as a medical device or you have a physical product that you put through testing, that you have documented properly what those devices looked like, how they were built, the revision levels in your DMR and other things, so you can then later prove equivalence to the device that you're going to put into commercial distribution. So tell me a little bit about that area because I think it's underlooked, and I would like to get your insights to things that you might have seen during inspections and other things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is definitely an area that I've certainly seen companies struggle with. Um, it kind of goes back to what we were saying a little bit earlier about, doing a lot of this early feasibility work and a lot of this early, breadboard and prototyping and things like that. And it's where you're depending on if you're going to be manufacturing that product yourself or if you're going to have a partner, a supplier doing it. That anything that you're doing in that early phase where you're doing testing, right? Design verification testing, design validation testing. The design validation testing is generally going to be some version of a test that you do on the bench, like in-house, or having a lab do it for you, versus design validation, which is more of a user experience where the users and it could be, like you said, an animal lab, it could be a cadaver lab, it could be an actual human trial, right? So the FDA's requirement, their expectation is that the devices that you are using for the testing, right, design verification, design validation, has to be as close to production level devices as possible or their equivalents, right? So if you have products that you have gotten from your supplier because it was those initial lot, we asked them for 100 prototypes, they made us 100 prototypes. They did it quickly. They didn't do it with the benefit of documentation. They didn't do it with any, approved device. We'll call it the device master record, right? But no procedures, no testing. The tests that the equipment that they used for the testing wasn't qualified or wasn't calibrated, or test methods weren't validated, right? So all of this, and even if it's just one of those, right? Your product that you introduced into the testing, which then becomes the basis for your submission, they're not equivalent, right? So now as a company, the burden of proof is on you to say, well, how are the devices that we submitted all of this testing for equivalent, or, justify how they're not equivalent, and how the lack of equivalency does not somehow adversely impact the results.
Right.
And it's a very tough slope, right? It's a very slippery slope when you start to say, well, yeah, we produced in a facility that doesn't have the same environmental conditions. It doesn't have, the benefit of calibrated equipment, and we don't have employees gowned, and we don't have employees trained, because the records that they used were not really they were in draft. They were recording their results on lab notebooks. I mean, I can go on and on about what I've seen,
Right.
and it becomes just very hard to justify how these are equivalent. So the watch out, and as I'm saying, kind of backing up to the very early conversations, is to say, well, we want to get those documents done early, right? We want to characterize our manufacturing process earlier. We want to, and yes, it always is going to take some prototypes to do that. You can't just have your first lot of production be the official production lot. I mean, these are the things that you have to really think about. And so the more equivalent that you can be in terms of your production, again, I've seen companies do everything that I mentioned and say, okay, well, now we're going to redo everything with production devices. And
Mm.
that just slows you down. It costs more money, right? And
Right.
so right, why not just have draft documentation, train everybody to that draft documentation, have calibrated equipment, make sure everybody's gowned the way that you expect them to be gowned in the future. Make
Mm.
sure that the environment is controlled. Make sure that you have, X, Y, and Z, and all of these things are in place. Now they could be in draft, but they should be relatively close to final. And then when you go ahead and submit, and you have to write up that justification for how those devices are equivalent, yeah, what are you going to say? Well, everything was in draft. However, nothing has changed since we've approved these documents, or the things that have changed are immaterial, right?
Mm.
We changed the chairs that we had in the room, or we did something that was immaterial to the production process,
Right.
um, or we scaled up, right? So you can say, well, we're submitting to the FDA a process which was scaled for 100 units, and we have since scaled up to 1,000 units, and we're going to submit a change request. We're going to qualify that. We're going to demonstrate how the units manufactured in 100, a lot of 100, are equivalent to the 1,000 piece lot, right? So you can easily justify that after the fact, but
Right.
try to be as close to production grade as possible for that initial set of design verification and validation tests. It just makes the submission go so much smoother.
Yeah. And also, I think in many cases, also people are doing the right things, engineers and others, they want to do the right thing. But I think that often the problem is that, the saying, if it wasn't documented, it never happened, right? So, for you to be able to prove that the devices used in DV&V are equivalent to what you're going to distribute, you need to have a record, period, right? So I think that's also the big part of it, right? So I think you say a lot of great things here to kind of give guidance, make sure that say it is a physical device that you're putting in place, that you have some sort of a manufacturing setup that you have some level of control of, that you can demonstrate. So in documents, right? Demonstrated control. Um,
Yeah,
but
I also, sorry to interrupt, Axel. I also recommend that even in the early design locations, so that those early, those R&D labs,
right.
I would say to do, to the extent that you possibly can, control at the very least, the equipment.
Mm.
Calibrate, qualify the equipment that's being used for those initial tests, because I have seen situations where they're using equipment that is not calibrated, And then
Yeah.
when they go ahead and try to manufacture it in production with calibrated equipment, they can't do it. And right. And
Yeah.
so it's like, everybody's pointing fingers. So
Right.
that's probably another watch out, is just to make sure that your development lab is controlled to the extent that it can be, as controlled as possible.
Yeah.
No food and drink in the lab. I mean, anything that you would want to have in production is really what you should have in development.
Yeah, and this kind of makes me think of another topic that is a big topic by itself. But when it comes to then, you talked about test method validation, right? And talked about calibration of equipment. But I think also it's overlooked process validation, right? So validated equipment, IQ, OQ, PQ, what have you, a test method validation, gauge R&R, all that kind of stuff, right? I think that's also not discussed a lot, and that's also an area where startups are just unaware. Going back to the control of equipment, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on process validation as well, because it kind of ties into what we talked about, right? If you're going to demonstrate control of an assembly line with different pieces of equipment, process validation is the foundation for that to
Right.
demonstrate that, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, process validation cover. I mean, that's like a whole nother quick talk,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
uh, but there are certain elements of it that are so critical. And I mentioned a couple of things already, like the environment, right, or the amount of people that would normally be in that environment, right? If you know that, hey, worst case scenario, we're going to have 8 people in this room, well, then you need to validate for that many people. Lot size is another big one. Like, how long does this take? Is this something that we only do within one shift? Is this something that we could do where there's a break, where people could go on break for an hour and then come back? How do we handle that? If we're talking about in vitro diagnostics or some medical devices that have cold chain requirements, right? So it's something that is frozen and something that has to come out and be thawed prior to processing, right? So how long does it take to thaw it? How long can it stay in its thawed state? And if that answer is 2 hours, well, then your validation needs to be up to 2 hours, right? And so you need to have all of your hold times for all of these different thawing and freezing and mixing, and all of these things have to be stressed, and they have to be documented that you've essentially stressed that process too. Again, the hold times, the thawing time, the number of people. And again, back to the equivalence argument, right? That's how you kind of get to your end goal, is that you have produced something in a validated process. And then you can also get the benefit of using those initial production units to not only do your testing, but you should also be, again, generally speaking, we have sterility, right? We have devices that are
Mm,
sterile or
mm,
have some sort of an expiration date. It could be not that they're sterile, but that they have an expiration date. Those two instances, you have to put those devices on stability almost at, like, very, very early.
that's a good point. That's not a good.
Yeah, but you can't
Yeah.
submit with
Yeah.
accelerated aging, and there's the Arrhenius equation, which you can
Right.
determine, 1 month is equivalent to 1 year and something like that, depending on the device. You present that to FDA, and they will generally accept, as long as you have product that's on real-time stability, and then you will continue to expand your labeling claim based on the real-time data. So
Hmm.
that's again why it's so important to have that early, as close to possible production process, so that you can actually start the things that take time, like stability and process validation and all of these other things.
Yeah, and also going back to where this conversation started in terms of interacting with FDA on an early stage, right? To get this their expectation, maybe they will require 6 months of actual aging stability data upon clearance, right? So if you don't know that, they can also shoot you down. You get to the end, and now you need to manufacture a product that you need to put on a shelf for 6 months before you can even start selling. So all
Hmm.
great points. So kind of going further down the road of this startup on its journey, and think about the scenario, you're in substantial review now of 510(k), right? And typically, even though you've had conversation with FDA prior, they are going to have questions, like inevitably. They're going to have questions for you, and typically you have a certain time period to respond to that. Talk a little bit about the guidance that you can give in terms of how to then, in that scenario, collaborate with FDA through the review process to not slow that down and be workable and just make sure that's a smooth process.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. So you would have to be very diligent, right? Any submission is going to certainly result in some questions, right?
Right.
You mentioned one of them, right? It could be like, okay, yeah, we see that you have your accelerated aging data. Could we just see where you are with your real-time study, right? And that's a question that you have to then respond to. And it could be that real quickly, somebody internally has to write an interim stability report, right? To say like, here we are after 2.5 months, right? Or whatever the time frame is, right? So those questions will almost always create activity that is required. And so the person who is receiving those questions should be known as like in American football, the quarterback, right?
Mm.
They don't have those answers generally, right? They're going to be going to R&D, they're going to be going to quality. They're going to be talking to operations. They're going to maybe even consult with marketing about maybe user needs or something like that, right? Or sales in terms of like how are we going to be training our customers and what's the training program going to look like, right? So all these questions are coming in, and so the main thought or the main goal for that is to respond to those questions completely and in a quick amount of time, right? So you want to keep the momentum going, right? You want to make sure, think of it in terms of, someone sends an email and you forget you sent the email. And then once you do get a response to that email, you have to kind of remember where you were and why you sent that email and who you sent it to and what were the questions you asked, right? So the quicker that you can respond, and you don't have to wait for if there were four questions, answering all four questions at once and kind of like batch response. The momentum is key and the completeness of the responses are key. It's always okay to ask follow-up questions, just like in a regular FDA inspection. If you're asked a question and you're a little bit unsure, definitely ask the follow-up questions, ask for clarification, make sure you know exactly what they're asking for, because that's going to then deploy all of that activity, and you want to
Right.
make sure that the activity is going in the right direction. And I think that also just continues to develop and nurture the rapport that you're building with this
Yeah.
reviewer.
Right.
And you're always trying to continue with the goodwill, right? That yeah, FDA's mission is to protect the public. Our mission is to protect the public. FDA's mission is also to get really good, innovative, life-saving technologies on the market. So they don't want to hold you back as much as you don't want to be held back.
Mm.
But they do have a job in terms of the protecting of the public. So those questions are generally always going to be something around how the product was designed, how it was tested, how it will be manufactured, how it will be packaged, what's on the label, the claims that you're making in terms of your shelf life, in terms of your use. So yeah, any of those questions you really should. And part of the answer to you, Axel, is also that person, that quarterback, in my opinion, and it's a different style for different people. In my opinion, the best thing to do is to involve all of the stakeholders in the process so
Right.
that everybody knows. So if they just ask the question about production, still involve everybody else,
Yeah.
right? So that
Yeah.
everybody knows what's happening
Right.
and everybody's there to help somebody else, right? We're
Right.
not doing this in silos because somebody in R&D might know something that can help the question that was really directed at production,
Right.
right? So again, that project manager or that quarterback really needs to just get everyone in the room, virtually or not, virtually or in person, get everybody together, make sure that they know what's being asked, put time frames, like who does what by when, and hold everybody accountable to it so that you can keep the momentum moving on that submission.
Right. And I think there are also some clear don'ts in this situation that might be worthwhile talking about. So, like, I think also just recognizing that the person that you interact with on the FDA side is also human, right? I think sometimes it's easy to see the FDA as a black box and just a police, right? But going back to this collaboration that you start in the pre-sub, also kind of remembering that, you're here to collaborate with a person, right? And also be respectful of that and also be careful. I agree with you, of course, if you don't understand what they're asking for, make sure you get, clarification on that, but also not like fight them, right? Because I've seen some bad scenarios where, you have some very intelligent, a PhD person that knows their science in and out, but they want to take they make this a hill to die on, right? And that can just go sour. So I don't know if you have
Yeah.
any thoughts there, but just kind of thinking about that this is a collaboration with FDA, and you also need to be respectful.
Yeah, so when it gets to the point where there's some disagreement, you certainly have to pick your battles, right? Exactly what you said. You have to say, well, all right, here's something that we're willing to basically just give in on. We do testing, and our testing is statistically relevant sample. And so, our sample size is just for argument's sake, on average, 20 pieces. And then the FDA might come in and say, well, this is new technology and we don't have a lot of experience with this. So we would like you to test no less than 40, right? So now hey, that costs a lot of money to test 40 when we were really only going to be testing on average 20.
Mm,
Well, okay, let's see what other questions they've asked, right? And you kind of have to figure out, like, all right, we definitely want to say no to that one, but let's see what other questions there are. And if that's the only question you have, um, then you maybe say, well, okay, we can commit to this, but can we also get agreement from you that after a year of doing this, that we could then revert back to a statistically relevant sample size, right? So it's not always set in stone, but it is that they're approaching it from the standpoint of maybe ignorance or maybe just caution. And
yeah,
so you have to think, well, all right, they're being cautious. They do care about public health, and we do too. Okay. So why don't we do that, right?
mm,
Why don't we do that? Or maybe let's negotiate and we'll meet in the middle and we'll say it's going to be 30, right?
yeah,
And you could do that too, right?
right,
But again, it really does depend on what you've already said no to
right,
and what
right,
they've agreed to, because then it
yeah,
becomes, like you said, you're dealing with
yeah,
humans and it
yeah.
becomes a tolerance.
Right, right. No, it's really insightful. That's awesome. All right, so I'm going to take us to the step further down the line here now. So you cannot pass clearance or an approval, um, or even I should say that you're in the substantial review might actually be better to kind of start with, because where I'm going with this is that as a startup, if you bring a product to the market the first time, you need to start gearing up for commercial distribution, right? And typically, best practices is, you don't want to wait with that until you have a clearance or approval. You need to start before that, right? But also with this, as a startup, you kind of go through almost like an identity crisis. You go from being an R&D startup to now, once you have your clearance or approval, medical device manufacturer with commercial products in distribution, right? So where I'm going with this question is that what are some of the things that you see as you start getting closer to then starting to distribute product? What should a startup kind of think about to set themselves up and be ready for that? Because you have a lot of post-market regulations and requirements to abide to, and you will inevitably have issues in the field, no matter how good you tested your device, no matter how good of a risk assessment you did. People will use your product in ways that you can never predict, right? So you will have to be able to manage quality events and other things. But anyway, so with that in mind, what recommendations do you have for a startup to kind of think about as they're getting close to commercialization? Things they should consider to kind of gear up with and be prepared for.
Yeah. Yeah. No, so this is exciting time, right? This is a really exciting time for on that journey. So I would say you would want to be thinking about the date of commercial distribution like a year in advance at a minimum, right? At a minimum. And so, we've already talked about that early stage where we're trying to figure out, well, let's maybe create a design control procedure and, well, let's have a pre-sub and okay, let's do our testing. Let's try to make sure that we're, getting to the point where we have equivalence to our production process, right? So we're kind of doing that now, right? And as we're doing that, we're on a journey to start to determine what other elements of our quality management system do we have to kind of like turn on, right? Do we have to like flip the switch on? And they're actually, during this time period, there should be almost a planned release of different elements of your quality system, right? So we talked about design controls, that's like procedure number one. And part and parcel with that is purchasing, like, how do you control your suppliers? And then we start to get into, well, we should probably have some sort of a change control procedure. And then, well, we're now getting to a point where we need to actually bring some items into our facility, and we should probably have a way to bring them in and to test them, store them, keep them safe, right? Because we want to make sure that our results are valid. And then we're going to continue on this journey. And even while we may be in parallel with having a submission in, um, well, we should let management know what's happening, right? We should let management know what's happening with our design development process, what's happening with our supply chain, what's happening with any issues that we have internally, any testing that has failed, any process validations that have happened, that have passed, that have failed. So this would be done in your management review. So we should have a management review procedure, kind of again leading up to commercial distribution, right? And part of management review is to make sure that we're doing some audits, internal audits. Like how is our design development process going? How is the supplier qualification process going? Right. So at some point, you start to flip the switch on certain procedures. And in order to maintain the suitability and effectiveness of your quality system, you should have some people that come on board, which kind of help you in this journey. Right. So you start to hire key people. Right. And so we've already talked about development and we've talked about those initial people that are going to help with the production process. So some operations people, some engineers, quality should be brought in at that point to kind of hold this all sort of together and make sure that we have procedures, that we're following those procedures, we're doing audits, and we're developing a quality culture, right? And we are on a journey. And yeah, like in day one, we might be doing things without qualified equipment or without calibrated equipment, or we might be bringing cans of soda into the laboratories, right? We're doing that early on, and that's okay, right? But we're on a journey and we're starting to say, well, hey, you know what was good back then is not good anymore. What got us here is not going to get us there. So we have to get better and we have to iterate and we have to and so bringing in a team who hopefully has some of this experience, who understands what it's like to be in a regulated industry, and who basically knows that what we're doing today at some point is going to be inspected by FDA. It may not be for another year or two or three, but we're basically developing and we're building a complete package of documentation that is essentially forming the basis for what will be inspected in the future, right? So even if we talk about inspection readiness, because eventually you will go commercial and you will get an inspection, inspection readiness is happening very early, right? It's not
Right.
something that we do 3 weeks before the FDA shows up.
No.
It's something that is taking time and we're building it in. And management, because they're going to have feedback from what's happening through management review. Management is going to be basically demonstrating their ability to make decisions based on what's good for the customer, not what's good for our investors, right? So those decisions and how those decisions are made and how those decisions affect employees, all of that is what's building a quality culture. And then eventually, as you're saying in your question, we're going to get to the point where we have to distribute products. So yeah, we have to release some procedures that are to address things that will be happening in the future, right? So how do we address complaints? Well, we have to write a complaint handling procedure way before,
Mm.
we start getting complaints, right?
Right.
We have to figure out how are we going to be investigating these complaints, right? Do we need to establish a complaint investigation lab? Are we going to be getting anything back,
Mm.
right? Should we have a way to handle that and test it and make sure that we know what went wrong? And we have to then have a CAPA process, right? How do we address problems? And we haven't really experienced any problems yet, but we know we will. Like you said, customers are going to be using our products in crazy ways. And then we might have to adjust our labeling. We might have to even do a recall. Who knows? So we got to figure out how to do a recall. So let's create a procedure around that. Let's even maybe do a mock recall to see how that goes, if everybody's aware of what to do. Right. So
Right.
all of that's kind of happening in this early phase so that when you do kind of get that letter in the mail and it says you can now distribute product, you are compliant. I mean, I have seen clients after the fact, not with my guidance, but I have seen clients actually submit 510(k) and get approval before doing anything that I said. So they even don't even have fully characterized their production process. They don't even know like the
Yeah.
thawing cycles and what works. So there are companies that are very comfortable with risk, and
Yeah.
they know that if they distribute product the day that they get that letter, they're distributing adulterated product on the market. So you have to know really that and have that comfortableness and that journey prior to distribution that you've demonstrated that you've got all of this laid down. You've got people, maybe you even solved some problems, right? That have happened early on.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of this would be what you should be thinking about and how to kind of get through that point. And then again, even after you go commercial, it's still a journey of improvement,
Right.
right?
Oh yeah.
That's
Right.
okay. And then this is when you start to think about, well, have we become a little bit more mature to where we maybe need some additional software tools like an electronic document management system or like some system that tracks our requirements for risk management? Because risk management is something that we're kind of doing all along.
Right.
But as we get complaints, we have to look at risk management to see, hey, like you said, hey, did we predict this from happening? If not, what does this impact in terms of our user needs, in terms of our design verification testing, what has to be redone? So then tools start to become a little bit more maybe necessary at that point. So you start to look at different electronic support tools for things like this, support tools for how to manage all of our calibrated equipment, all of the preventive maintenance that needs to be done. And you start to bring tools in like this because Excel is no longer going to help us. And so,
Hmm.
but that's all what's happening kind of as you're on that journey, thinking about either pre or post distribution.
Hmm.
Uh, and then, a lot of those conversations are happening around the cost and when we can bear that cost. And maybe we should wait or hold off until we've really started selling and that kind of thing too. So yeah, all of those considerations are happening in that sort of like year or even maybe longer, but definitely in that year before distribution and then into the post distribution phase.
Right. No, there's a lot of things that come to mind hearing you talk about this, so some guidance to the audience here that are startups, right? So the ways that you can manage this, at least from my own experience, like, you should have a robust business plan, right? So what you talk about here in terms of gearing up in a proper manner can also be outlined in a business plan because that's also tied to HR plan, right? To your points, like when can we afford to hire someone, right? In many cases with startup, it's more like hiring someone like you, a part-time, like a fractional QA manager or a regulatory affairs director or something, but having
Mhm.
someone on a retainer or whatever. Um, but that can be strategically done within your business plan, right? So I think that's something that can also be really managed. Another point that I want to come back to real quick is also the example that you had there that someone got a 510(k) clearance and they are nowhere near to sort of be ready to distribute. And that's not just a problem from a compliance perspective, but if you're a venture-backed company, your investors, they're gonna expect you to have revenue pretty much immediately after that clearance. So that's another way to think about it in terms of not only gearing up to be in compliance and be audit ready and all that kind of stuff, but also from a commercial success as a startup, you know, when you get that clearance, you should just be ready to go, right? Because that's the expectation from your investors. If you have a 6 month delay, they're not going to be happy. It's like you got a clearance 6 months ago. Where's the money? So that's
Yeah.
another way to think about it. So it's not only, from a startup perspective, of course, being compliant and have quality, that's essential. You can't be in medical devices without being compliant. But also from a startup perspective, being venture backed, there's that side of things too, they are like tied together. So you have different expectations that you need to meet in that manner, which is can be handled like a business plan and other things. But yeah, we're kind of coming to the end here, Vin, but it's been amazing talking to you. A lot of great insights. For the audience that will kind of want to learn a little bit more about this or even reach out to you to get some help, what do you have for guidance on that side of things?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly before you call me, there is so much free information on FDA's website. And I know that sounds kind of like a cliche, but this isn't like the ISO standards where you have to pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Like the regulations, all of the guidance documents, these are all free and they give so much really, really good information and they give insights into some of the things that we're talking about. Like just right now, I'm thinking of a recently released guidance document on cybersecurity, right? A lot of devices are connected. The cybersecurity guidelines, they really give a lot of good information about what you should be thinking about. And if for nothing else, if you learn a little bit and you're a founder and you're an innovator and you're not somebody who knows this area, if you become a little bit more conversational about it, you would know whether or not you were being taken advantage of by a consultant, right? So
Mm.
you should know that. You should know
Yeah.
that exactly what, not exactly, but you should know whereabouts what something is required. And yeah, so I would say that's the main way that I would start and become a little bit familiar. And as you mentioned, Axel, the fractional piece I think is very, very cost effective. It's a few hours a week of helping with this guidance.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I've actually done that, but I've also been the one, because of my contacts, I've been the one to actually place the quality person, the permanent quality person,
Mm.
right? Because they also don't know what they're looking for in a
Yeah.
quality person.
Help with recruitment. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's more than just, making decisions or signing some document, but it really is helping with the strategy and with that eventual staffing of the right people and of that building of the quality culture.
Right. No. And if someone wanted to reach out to you, what is the best way to get hold of you?
Oh, well, if you know me, you search for me on LinkedIn, you're going to see some fun topics that I talk about almost weekly. So we're having some fun conversations on LinkedIn. Go to LinkedIn. That's where you're going to find me. It's going to link to my company. If you want to go directly to my company, it's creoconsulting.com. And if you do happen to find me on LinkedIn, get in there, check my posts out, comment. I reply to almost all of them. So it's very interactive. We have a fun conversation. The community is always full of ideas and full of comments. And so, yeah, that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Well, Vin, this has been fantastic. A lot of great insights. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Again, many thanks for chatting with me today.
My pleasure. Always my pleasure. Thank you, Axel.
If you enjoyed this episode of Quick Talk, hit like and subscribe. And for additional educational content, visit our website at quickvault.viva.com.